We do have Spanish interpretation today, should participants need it. And because of this, all attendees need to select your language at the bottom of the screen. So you'll see a button that says interpretation, you select English or Spanish, and then you'll need to do that at the end of the meeting when we come back after we do our group breakouts. If you don't, then you may hear the volume being lowered if you don't select your language. Next slide. Great. Annabella, could you please read the information on the slide out loud for our Spanish folks?
La interpretación en simultáneo para esta reunión se dará en los siguientes idiomas. Español, bajo la opción de español. Por favor, hagan clic en el icono Interpretación en la barra de herramientas para acceder al idioma deseado. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you. So we are recording the workshop today, and we will be posting the presentation video on the project website so that you can access it there. And if you have any questions or technical difficulties, just send us a note in the chat. And if you're on the phone, if you want to indicate that you're raising your hand, you can press *9. So we will address questions if possible as we go, but we're really going to wait for the end of the presentation and the small group breakouts to get into discussion and questions. And if you're not speaking, please remember to keep your audio muted. All right, next slide. Right, so there are a few ways to share your thoughts today. We are going to be doing some live polling throughout the presentation using mentee.com, and we're also going to use a platform called padlet.com in the small group breakout. So both of these platforms are anonymous unless you already have an account and you're logged in. And you can chat your questions to the team during the polls if you have any technical difficulties too. We'll give a couple of minutes to let folks get set up. There is also going to be a survey at the end of the workshop. It's more of kind of an interactive online activity with mapping. And so we strongly encourage you to add your thoughts, add your comments, and share them with your friends and neighbors, and encourage people to do the same. And we do have some upcoming meetings after today that we wanted to share and encourage you to attend. So tomorrow there's a Transportation and Mobility Technical Advisory Committee. We are going to be going over most of the same information today, but that's at 3 p.m. if anyone's interested. June 10th is our next GPAC meeting, and we'll be discussing the updated land use alternatives, and then also some broad takeaways from today. And more meetings are coming up throughout the summer. So if you haven't signed up to receive notices, you can go and do that on the project website, and then also check out the calendar page to see all of the scheduled meetings and information to sign up for those. Okay, next slide. So we like to remind folks at the beginning of community events of some simple rules of engagement, like being a good listener, welcoming all viewpoints and valuing diversity, showing common courtesy and respect, sharing the air, avoiding editorials, and honoring time. So just to keep in mind, it's just a discussion today. We encourage everyone to listen and to respect each other's points of view, and we're not making any decisions today, but the main goal is really to hear everybody's thoughts and input. Okay, next slide. So we're going to pause for a few minutes here to do our first mentee poll. So if you can open up a web browser, another window, or you can use your cell phone. You go to mentee.com, MENTI.com, and once you're there, you enter the meeting code. So the code for today is 75565260. If you're savvy, you can also use the QR code on the screen. I'm getting familiar with how to use those too. So if you have any difficulties, just post your question in the chat. Can we I see that there's two different codes in the chat. Can we clarify that it is the 7556 code? Thank you. Okay, yes. So the correct code is 7556 5260. All right, so questions will appear throughout the meeting as we go, and Zach's going to be helping us with the polls throughout the workshop today. Thanks, Disa, for the confirmation. So Zach, let's get started with our first warm-up question. It looks like folks are already getting there.
Absolutely. And is that sharing on the screen?
Yep.
Great. So the first question we have is just for you to test out the tool and let us know what your favorite way to get around Culver City is. All right, and we'll move it on to the next one and you'll be able to go through those. So the next one is just to get a little bit more information about everyone joining us today. So we've got a couple of questions about that. Great, and then these similar questions. All right, fantastic. It looks like our participation is going up with each question. So again, this is just going to test out the tool here. Then a couple of questions just about Culver City itself in terms of your living condition and also how many years you as well. Then we have a question about what neighborhood in Culver City you currently reside in, if you do, or Mark, if you currently live outside of Culver City. All right, cool. Looks like we got representation across many different parts of the city, as well as people joining us from outside of Culver as well. And then one last question for this section here. Awesome, great. So we will reuse this tool in a little bit later on in the meeting to get some feedback on some of the transportation concepts and ideas that we are going to present. So I'm going to flip back over to the presentation now, and Eric is going to give a quick overview just on the general plan update itself.
Thanks, Zach, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Yurkovich. I'm a principal at Ramey & Associates. I'm so excited to be here tonight to talk to you guys about mobility and the mobility alternatives. I'm also excited to see that many of you have already attended the past workshops and the recent TAC meeting, so we're super excited to see you all returning this evening as well. As Zach said, my job tonight is really to provide a brief overview of the general plan, talk about where we are in the process itself, and then highlight those kind of vision and core values that we've been working with you on over the last several years. But before I really get started, I just want to kind of pause and acknowledge that we really have a big opportunity ahead of us. We're coming together as a group to really think about what it is to have an equitable plan for Culver City and the community. And the general plan really affords a unique opportunity to develop a roadmap that makes Culver City the best that it can be, both for its workers, for its residents, and as well as its visitors. And our goal is really to create a place that everyone can thrive. This is our chance, as there are many of these opportunities throughout the process, to have these community-wide conversations about what we love about Culver City, about dreaming up solutions to the challenges that we face, and really setting our vision for the future. But we need everyone engaged in that process, sharing your unique perspectives and ideas so that we can really come together to build a Culver City for all. So that includes being here tonight at this meeting, but also talking to your friends and neighbors and colleagues and getting them engaged in this process as well. You can go to the next slide, Zach. As many of you know, the general plan is a long-range policy document that maps out how the city of Culver City serves the community. California law requires that every city and county in the state develop and maintain a general plan. Everything from parks to shopping centers and housing to roads and transit is a result of this type of planning effort. The plan itself really establishes that shared 25-year vision for the future, building on community strengths and assets while tackling new and emerging challenges. But the general plan isn't just about coming together to talk about the future of Culver City. It's also about coming together to acknowledge the challenges that we face today. So as we start to plan for the future, and then we start to think about the mobility networks, the goals and policies that we're going to be talking about later today, we want to make sure that it lines up with what you care about now as well. So whether it's things like addressing traffic jams or the housing crisis or climate change, we need everyone involved to kind of help tackle those big challenges. Next slide. The state of California requires all cities and counties to address 8 mandatory elements as listed at the top of the slide. These include land use and circulation, which we're going to be talking about specifically today, housing, conservation, open space, noise, safety, and environmental justice. But as you know, mobility is kind of one of those topics that touches all elements of the general plan. So we're going to be focusing on on circulation today, but it touches each and every one of those elements as well. General plans really allow a lot of flexibility about what are the types of topics and how communities address those. And so in addition to those mandatory elements listed at the top, the C is also going to adding these additional topics to things like climate change, arts and culture, community health and well-being. Next slide. This graphic shows a simplified process for the general plan update. We really kicked off the process with the discovery phase, reviewing existing documents and policies, assessing existing conditions, and publishing a series of reports, some of which Zach and Jimmy will talk about in their presentations a little bit later on. We then worked with the community and the General Plan Advisory Committee to really understand what you love about the city and what you'd like to see in the future. This listening really helped us draft that vision statements and series of core values and guiding principles. We've now really moved into that phase of the project where we're developing land use and mobility alternatives that we're discussing with community currently. But tonight we're really focused on those mobility alternatives. Next slide. So during this process, we have completed a number of kind of community engagement events and activities to date. And this slide is just a simple snapshot of that engagement. These include in-person activities like the visioning workshop and pop-up meetings. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've pivoted to more online engagement. So those include videos, online surveys, and these types of virtual workshops and meetings. Next slide. And during 2019-2020, we really worked to develop a vision for the general plan. The vision really sets and provides an umbrella for the general plan, articulating where we want to be in the future. So Culver City in 2045 continues to be a vibrant, unique, and diverse community with a strong social and economic fabric stitched together by its arts and cultural assets, creative enterprises, high-quality services, and inclusiveness. It is a progressive and bold city leading the region to address complex challenges in housing, transportation, public health, public safety, and the environment. Its residents, workers, businesses, and visitors enjoy smart and modern infrastructure and fiscal sustainability, stewarded by a commitment to equitable planning for the future generations that will inherit Culver City as a home, as their neighbor, or as a cultural and economic destination. Next slide. We have a real opportunity in Culver City's general plan to really capture a set of community values. So throughout the process, we heard the belief in creativity and innovation, sustainability, equity and inclusiveness, and compassion for all. The general plan must really embrace and embody those values to guide both the work that we're doing right now with you, but also to guide future decisions and policymaking. And while the vision tells us where we want to be in the future, and the policies and actions that we'll be defining later are going to tell us what we're going to do, these community values really describe how we're going to implement those activities. So tonight, as you think about mobility and solutions for mobility in the community, think about these core values and how they work towards each of these core values and that larger vision for the future of Culver City. With that, I'll thank you all for participating tonight. I look forward to meeting you all in the breakout rooms, and I will pass it over to Zach to talk about mobility.
Thank you, Eric. I'm just trying to hide the little thumbnail of myself. So I am going to quickly walk through some of the existing conditions work that we've performed over the last year or so, and some of the original findings that we've received from the community, as well as some of the advisory groups that we've been working on. And then Jimmy will run through some mobility alternatives that we've developed, and we'll work towards a group discussion activity. So building off of what Eric presented, mobility and transportation as a whole is one of the guiding principles of the general plan update to facilitate the core values of innovation and creativity, equity and inclusion, and compassion and community, which are all identified from the previous community engagement activities that have been a founding part of this process. And our role as the transportation team is to help develop a new circulation element focused on holistic mobility that can provide more reliable, safe, affordable, and connected transportation options for all travelers, residents, visitors, and workers within Culver City. And in doing this, we can also address a number of the other guiding principles that have been established as part of the 2045 General Plan update. So through this process, we want to recognize the intersectionality between the guiding principles of the General Plan update and mobility as a whole. So when we think about infrastructure, that's one of the key components of the city that the transportation network in itself is one of the most tangible aspects of city infrastructure that folks in the community interact with on a daily basis, be that roads or sidewalks. When we look at urban design, we want to think about how transportation is key in supporting future growth in a sustainable manner, be that creating more vibrant public spaces, opportunities for gathering, and bringing people closer to affordable housing and job opportunities as well. When we think about community health, we want to recognize that the social determinants of health and wellness are highly correlated to transportation and accessibility, whether that means more reliable and affordable and easier ways to reach goods and services, job opportunities, and education, as well as making sure that the transportation network also provides opportunities for physical activity. And then on a side piece of that, it would be considering the negative externalities of mobility, such as vehicular pollution. Looking at public safety, so key to our work in forwarding the city's vision of eliminating collision-related deaths and implementing complete streets practices, so making streets safer for all travelers, regardless of their age or ability. And then finally, climate action planning is another key cornerstone of the general plan update. And when we look at mitigating the impacts of climate disruption, ensuring that marginalized residents and stakeholders are resilient to climate change and risks in the future, reducing vehicle miles traveled and increasing the share of trips that are made by modes other than automobiles is one of the biggest steps that we can make as a community to reducing our own carbon footprint and making a global impact. So thinking about how this relates into the general plan update itself, the city's current circulation element was originally adopted in 1995, and many of those goals, policies, and objectives are still reflective of that time. So our purpose in terms of creating a new mobility element is to set a vision for transportation around revitalizing the local street system and reducing traffic congestion as part of the whole effort of updating the general plan. In doing so, we want to make sure that we're building upon existing policies and design guidelines, as well as translating previously established mobility goals and visions into more viable policies and actions that can be implemented over the course of the general plan. And in doing so, this will also require incorporating some new legislative requirements, ensuring that we consider regional and global best practices, and taking into account directions from city departments that work on a daily basis in terms of trying to implement transportation projects and keeping the system moving on a daily basis. And of course, taking as much input as we can from our advisory groups and the community. So this element will look closely to consider the work being done on the land use element, so we can better tie these outcomes to housing and jobs and ensure that the city's transportation network and mobility policies support anticipated growth in a safe and equitable manner. So looking at some of the key findings from our existing conditions work and original advisory workshops, some of the key considerations that we want to think about as we update the general plan for transportation is recognizing that the city is part of a complex regional network. So Culver City is surrounded by the city of Los Angeles, as well as several unincorporated county areas on all sides. And many of the city's roadways connect to regional motor vehicle traffic, and this poses challenges for the citywide's overall transportation network. It also means that the city is prone to cut through traffic, so vehicle trips that are either beginning or ending in locations outside of Culver City, but are passing through Culver City. And oftentimes these are on neighborhood streets where folks are walking, biking, would like to see lower travel speeds. Another issue related to this is a local jobs and housing imbalance that contributes to traffic congestion, with many jobs in Culver City filled by workers commuting from elsewhere in the region, as well as many residents of Culver City who work elsewhere needing to get outside of the city on a daily basis. So in some cases, major streets like Overland, Sepulveda, Washington are not always within the city's boundaries. So this means that in terms of transportation improvements and reallocation with space, this requires significant coordination with regional planning efforts and other jurisdictions. In considering that pass-through traffic, again, that detracts from the comfort and safety of people that are walking and biking on neighborhood streets. as well as some of the principal roadways that go through downtown Culver City. As development and workforce increases in Culver City and surrounding West Side communities, we also want to consider how that may place strain on the transportation network, which will increase the need for strategies that reduce vehicle trips and also demand for parking. And then finally, we have heard from a number of folks is a lack of a full north-south or east-west connectivity across the entire city that you can make on a low-stress facility. So something like a separated bicycle path, for example, that's comfortable for people walking, biking, rolling, running, all of that. So how might we address some of these things? So some key opportunities that have arisen is, again, making sure that we are recognizing that these mobility solutions that we implement are not merely a mechanism to address the negative impacts of traffic and congestion, but making sure that we leverage these tools to achieve the broader general plan update goals of social equity, environmental sustainability, economic development, public health and safety. So really thinking about all of those different issues when we prioritize transportation projects. And in addition, the city has done a lot of work in recent times, so making sure that we build across all of that work, such as implementing sustainable mobility services and infrastructure as recommended in continuous multiple local and regional plans and work programs, and building off the work that the city has already done with the development of the bicycle and pedestrian plan update. A couple of more, the city has also developed the 2017 Transit-Oriented Development Plan Visioning Study, and this can help the city achieve better outcomes when we look at designing growth around all modes of travel more inclusively, as opposed to just planning around the automobile being the dominant form of transportation. The city has also worked with Los Angeles County Metro to explore the use of strategies that will reduce traffic congestion and increase options for getting to existing transit services like the Metro E-Line light rail, through looking at strategies that reduces barriers in the first last mile between key destinations and transit services. And then finally, we need to consider how technologies are rapidly changing and how even the recent pandemic has shown that travel patterns can shift pretty rapidly with unforeseen events. So just making sure that any recommendations we make for the city's transportation future considers how any new technologies can be leveraged, but also making sure that those solutions are implemented in a manner that is equitable and really considers the end user in terms of how that's going to serve members of the community and everyday travelers. So going pretty quickly here, just a recap of some stakeholder feedback that we've received to date from the community, city staff, and particularly the advisory committees that we've met with a couple of times in this process. So one thing that we really hear a lot in terms of key desires for future investments is ways to look at reducing that cut through traffic. So all of those trips that are not really serving Culver City, but are passing through the transportation network. Looking to provide and promote safer options for people walking and biking, and looking at some key cores to do that. One of those that we've heard a lot would be looking at ways to enhance Ballona Creek for more safe and comfortable travel, and really looking at how we can make those east-west or north-south full connections on lower stress, more comfortable facilities. Finally, prioritizing the safety and comfort of travelers other than just focusing on the movement of vehicles and roadway design. Some key concerns that we've heard through our outreach include the volume of traffic and speeds of vehicles on residential streets, limited ways to get all the way across the city or key destinations without a car, and making sure that we improve access to jobs and affordable housing options. So how might we achieve all this? That's a big question. A key outcome is to make sure that we are making it easier to access the places that make Culver City a great place to live. So this means looking at how we can enable residents to serve their daily needs through a variety of different transportation options to get to the grocery store, to get to school, to get to parks, all of those great things. And in doing so, it's critical that we lead in designing of our transportation network to a standard that really makes facilities accessible to everyone. And one concept is 8 to 80 design. So if we are designing, for example, a bicycle facility or pedestrian facilities, we want to make sure that that experience is safe and comfortable for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old. And that should be able to really accommodate all users of all ages and abilities. So some of the key input that we've received so far in terms of things that we may want to consider in terms of implementing these are making sure that we're asking if equitable access and connectivity is existing for all neighborhoods in the city, and making sure that residents in all areas of the city are reliably able to reach amenities and service. Another is to consider the needs and deficiencies in outlying areas and residential neighborhoods, not just considering some of the key catalytic areas that we're looking at with future land use growth or the downtown area. And then building off that idea of 8 to 80 design, designing with dignity. So making sure that we're implementing designs that are really focused on safety, be that detective warning devices at crossings, making crossings safer for seniors, children, and people with mobility devices. And then finally, making sure that we align transportation investments with future development, not just as a response to growth after the fact. So with that, we have a couple of more MentiMeter questions, and then we will move towards looking at some of the transportation analyses. So if you just recently joined us, or if you have been on already, on the screen is the URL to mentee.com, as well as the code to access this particular survey. And Lauren has also just reposted that in the Zoom chat.
And if you're on audio only, you can do the code is 75565260, and you can access it on your smartphone if you're using one, or a web browser.
Oops. There we go. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why it wasn't showing. All right, and I think we're getting pretty close to the number we were at for the previous surveys. We just got 2 more here. It looks like some of you have already gotten to that one. So what are some of the most critical outcomes for you in terms of the future mobility investments that we should achieve? And then if you have other comments, again, please feel free to write those in the Zoom chat. It looks like we've already getting quite a few pieces of feedback there as well. Fantastic. And then one more question here, going back towards thinking about neighborhoods. So you're able to enter a couple, I think up to 4 or 5, looking at which neighborhoods have the greatest need for transportation network improvements in your opinion. Great, and this Mentimeter will stay active through the presentation. So if you're able to log in and provide your input, it will still go in there. So we'll be able to collect that all at the end. So your feedback will still be collected even if you weren't entering it as I was going on the screen. Great. So now I'm going to flip back over to the presentation, and Jimmy Mitchell is going to take over sharing his screen, and he's going to run us through some of the mobility alternatives that we have developed to date.
Okay, thanks, Zach. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see my screen. Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. So my name is Jimmy Mitchell. I'm also with Nelson Nygaard. So I'm leading some of the technical analyses going into the development of mobility options and scenarios. I'll talk a little bit about what those mean and the objectives of this analysis process going forward and what's entailed with it, what we're going to be doing with this information. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I know we've talked a little bit about sort of the objectives of the overall general plan and the mobility and circulation vision. But just to reiterate, we are looking at a transformative and holistic approach to mobility in Culver City. And we have to acknowledge that it does take a village to be able to do that and achieve that, meaning your public sector, your private sector, the individual residents, business owners, community members need to really buy into the types of strategies and projects and programs that we'll be talking about implementing in the future to make sure that we can come to a common ground in terms of our goals, objectives, and then implement the vision in real life so that we can get away from this auto-centric and auto-dominated mobility network and get more towards, like I said, that holistic network that allows priorities and prioritization for other modes and spaces for those modes to function. And that's all part of the keys to successful growth, obviously. So just to bring you back a little bit about just the mobility analysis approach, we do like to talk a little bit about the travel markets in terms of how different markets and different trips behaviors and travel destinations might dictate different needs in terms of mobility solutions. And generally, we think about this in two big buckets. So I'm just going to use that for simplicity for right now, is talking about regional trips, which are usually taken by commuters or from trips for special events and things like that. So we're talking about trips coming into Culver City from outside. Longer distances generally taken either by high capacity transit, meaning rail lines, Metro Rail, for example, or some of the larger bus lines, higher volume bus routes that are out there, or if you're talking about single occupancy vehicles. Sorry,
so sorry to interrupt you. If you could just slow down just a little bit, our Spanish interpreters are having a hard time keeping up.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. Okay, I am a fast talker.
No
I get excited. No. So, okay, starting back with travel markets, we're talking about behaviors, the trip patterns that are happening today, right? So how are people moving around? What types of trips are they taking? Are they shorter trips? Are they longer trips? And then what's the right type of service to be able to accommodate those trips? And so that's what we really mean when we talk about travel markets. When we say mobility network, just so you're going to hear this over and over again, we're talking about basically the infrastructure that's out there. So the existing roadways, the bike paths, the multi-use paths, the sidewalk network. What is the infrastructure that people use for transportation and mobility today? And so those, we'll talk a little bit about what the investments in those, the mobility network would mean from a capital investments, construction type of projects. And then there's also services, meaning the operations of the bus routes or, other mobility services within that network or on that network. So those are sort of the general big pieces that we're talking about. Getting back to the travel markets, when we think about the I would say the other side of the coin from those regional trips and those commuter trips is more for those local trips within Culver City, which are generally taken by residents, or some of those after work trips by employees or visitors who are coming in, maybe doing multiple trips within Culver City to stop and do some of their activities of daily living, shopping, leisure, etc. And those are the ones we really want to promote alternative methods than the single occupancy vehicle and the auto trip for. So we're talking about investments primarily in the pedestrian network, the bicycle network, the transit network, and these other services that can, be not necessarily replacements for the auto, but an attractive alternative to the automobile, and I'll say it that way, and that we're trying to make sure that the network is really supportive of these other trips that are going to be more, less than 5 miles or so, for instance, that could be achieved without taking a vehicle on or an automobile. And so those are sort of the big picture sort of mobility needs that we're talking about addressing within the general plan. How do we deal for these bigger trips that are happening regionally, and how do we make sure we're accommodating the local trips that are happening, and we're not, discounting the needs for residents of Culver City to get around effectively. And so we have to make sure, as a general plan, we're doing all of those things, because we want to make sure we're accommodating the mobility network for everyone. And within the general plan, the goal as part of this general plan is to come up with policies and then programs to implement in the future. There will be next steps to the general plan in terms of implementation. But one of the things that we're trying to understand, and this is some of the things that are regulated and required, is that when you're adding new development, when you're building new projects, it's very important to know what the traffic impact of these new projects is going to be. And as we're talking about, investing in the multimodal network, meaning the bicycle, pedestrian, and transit active transportation network, the benefits of those investments and the ways that they could reduce auto trips and vehicle car trips is not traditionally captured well in some of the modeling that we do from a engineering and transportation analysis perspective. Traditionally, transportation analysis and what it calls travel demand analysis is done at a regional level. So you're looking at trips all over the region, and so it's very hard for those things to really absorb and understand what's happening at the local level. And so we're looking at how do we reduce trips in autos, looking at these investments that are not well captured in the regional traditional modeling sense. And so our approach is within the general plan to come up with a couple of sets of alternatives, meaning packages of projects that look more into the multimodal network, the active transportation, bike and ped network, and then try to figure out how we can estimate the ways those investments will reduce auto trips. And there's an adopted format for doing that within the state of California. It's called CAPCOA. We don't really need to get into the weeds of CAPCOA right now, but what that does is that it basically has an adopted set of trip reduction factors that you can use to be able to estimate what that benefit is going to be. And so the image on the left is just giving you an idea of what the different groups of or categories of improvements or packages of improvements that are covered by this trip reduction tool, what they are actually able to capture, and what we can understand in terms of mobility from the tool. And we're talking about how does changes in land use, meaning density, how does that change the way people might move around? If you now have your developments closer around, hopefully you won't need to drive anymore. It'll be more walkable. We're talking about site enhancements, and that can be anything from open spaces and parks to better pedestrian accommodations, wider sidewalks, et cetera. Parking policy and management of transportation in general. So you're talking about, how do you manage the curb space? What is your parking policies? How do you make sure that your development and your land use is linked to your parking, for example? The transit system improvements, meaning route changes, frequency changes, things of that nature. Commuter trip reduction can have a myriad of things. This is generally also called TDM, transportation demand management, and that's generally incentivized policy behaviors when you're trying to either give new develop or implement programs to change the behavior of people through financial incentives or partnerships, meaning you might have transit pass programs or employee commuter programs, things of that nature. So those are generally policy oriented, not necessarily capital investments in things that are going in the ground. And also things like congestion pricing, which is really I would say capitalizing and monetizing some of the aspects of the mobility network when it comes to toll lanes and things of that nature. So there's lots of different pieces to the puzzle. What we are going to be focusing on primarily within the conversation today and moving forward is those capital investments, which are those tangible projects that will be built and to expand the mobility network, sidewalks, bike lanes, transit facilities, things of that nature, and those services that will be operated on those lanes, again, in that transit, bike, and ped type of environment, as well as some of these newer new solutions like shared mobility rides, flexible on-demand zones and things of that nature. So that's primarily what we're going to be looking at in terms of how we estimate the trip reduction potential of these other aspects of the mobility plan and circulation. What we've done is we've developed two potential alternatives, and these are scenarios which are packages of projects again. One of them is called the fiscally constrained alternative, which, as the name implies, is grounded in a little bit of more of the financial reality and the revenue generating potential of Culver City, making sure that we're not getting out above or ahead of ourselves in terms of putting too much in there that more than we can afford. The aspirational scenario adds a little bit more investments to different types of treatments, or just expands on what's in the financially constrained, assuming that we're going to have to go out and find funds from elsewhere, meaning things that aren't already programmed, or revenues that aren't already allocated by the city. And so that's sort of a general differentiator between the two. But the goal is to compare these two alternatives, looking at how we think these could reduce the trips that are generated, and then try to use what we learn from the analysis to inform what the best pieces of each of those alternatives are to move forward and recommend for implementation, or how we gauge the way that we can reduce trip production on a project by project basis as those get implemented downstream and in the future. So we're not looking at a singles project right now. We're not looking at a specific location right now. We're looking at the city as a whole and try to understand how these packages of improvements, by comparing the overall packages, could then tell us what is the best type of solution to implement going forward, and how we should look at calculating the trip reduction potential. And so, as we talked about mobility and land use being linked, the land use component of the general plan is moving forward in parallel. And this is just an example of where some of those areas of zonal change in terms of the land use changes could occur, upzoning and things of that nature, and where, relatively and geographically speaking, some of the areas that we know from a transportation traditional analysis perspective we want to focus on in terms of connecting people and connecting services. And so those easier low-hanging fruit places where we know services need to be and we know people are trying to get to are already sort of established within the built environment out there, but we're thinking about connectivity to the transit nodes, meaning the E-line stations, the existing Westfield Culver Transit Center, and some very specific high volume intersections like Sepulveda and Venice, which is also pictured here. So those are the places that we can immediately know we want to look at in terms of where should we invest in the network. But we're also using information like the forecasted change in travel patterns and trip patterns. Are there any places where we're going to have a lot of growth in the future, and that's going to induce a lot more auto trips potentially if we don't do something to change the paradigm? And those are the areas where we've also tried to focus our investments to make sure that we're trying to mitigate or reduce the amount of additional trips in the future based on the growth that we think is going to happen in Culver City going down the line. And this is just an example of what those sort of trip patterns look like. When you're looking at the trips from the travel demand modeling perspective, we break them down into zones called traffic analysis zones. And that's what those borders are that you see on this map, is what the traffic analysis zones for Culver City are. And so you can essentially think about looking at the movement of people between zone to zone, and the shaded regions of the map are basically telling you the volume of trips that are happening in that one zone, how many trips are coming into the zone and leaving that zone every day. And so obviously the darker the color, that's the more trips that are being generated. And so that sort of gives us an understanding again of where some of those high generating areas are and where some of those bottlenecks might be, hotspots might be. And so where we might need to again make sure we're investing in the multimodal network. So that includes places currently like downtown, obviously, Studio Village, the Sony lots, corporate points, the Fox Hills Mall, et cetera, have already been established and are known as high trip generating areas. And so we want to make sure that we are developing solutions that can address those, as well as other gaps within the mobility network. But this is just one of those indicators, one of those sources of data that we use to help inform where we're putting in our investments. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the pieces of these alternatives right now, like what goes into these alternatives and what's in these scenarios. What we've tried to do is break this down into some general categories of mobility, whether we're talking about the fixed route transit network, which is traditionally bus service, the active transportation and multimodal network, which is your bicycle and pedestrian trails, your bike lanes, your any other pathways. And there's some new emerging mobility solutions like mobility hub concepts, which many of you are probably familiar with from the E-Line station, where you have bike hubs and several different services connecting there. But how do we expand that in other areas of Culver City? How do we create good typology so that it can be implemented at a scale that's appropriate? And then some of these other services, like I was talking about, on-demand, shuttle services, circulators, shared mobilities, scooter share, bike share, car share, all these types of things that are out there. And so how do we integrate those into the mobility network in the future? And so those are sort of the basic components and building blocks of the two alternatives. And with each of these capital investments and service changes that we could potentially be talking about, there is a other side of the coin, meaning the policy side. So how do we make sure that we're putting the policies in place that the city then has the authority to do these things, or the operators or vendors have the ability to operate successfully or safely or efficiently in the spaces? The policies are things that are happening and being developed in tandem with these capital investments and these alternatives, but those are going to take a little bit more time. I'm just going to volunteer that right now, that we are not going to be able to get into the policy sort of meat of the conversation tonight. We're trying to stick with the capital projects and services on the left side, so that we can make sure that we're developing a program that meets the needs, and then we can make sure that we're setting forth the policies that will allow those to get implemented. And so that's sort of the train of thought that I would like you to go within tonight as we start talking about these alternatives. There are absolutely policy questions. There are absolutely decisions that need to be made in terms of how they operate and where and why. But we need to understand what we're operating first before we make sure we can give them the right, guidelines and technical provisions to do it. And so we're just a little bit about what we anticipate in terms of outcomes. And from this effort, again, this is the analysis effort that we're talking about in general. The general plan itself is a tool that's going to guide the future policies, codes, and regulations of Culver City. And so when you're talking about your affordable housing plans, what's your transit vision, what's your parking guidelines and provisions, what's your active transportation, what's the future of Biona Creek, and some of these very priority elements within the network. Those will be fleshed out in subsequent plans and studies, but the general plan is basically going to give you your marching orders in terms of how we want you to, what are your objectives as you go into your next update of your roadway design guidelines or your bus operation guidelines. And so that's why this general planning effort is really important, because it basically dictates sort of the priorities for those implementation plans and studies in the next phase. But from the approach that we're at right now, we're dealing with assembling alternatives that we can compare to inform these decision makings about what needs to be in these projects and what policies will help and allow those to go into place. And so we're going to be comparing these two investment alternatives to look at how the range of trip reduction differs between the two. And we're going to see, okay, well, which component is really having more impact here or there, pull out the right pieces, assemble those into a set of recommendations later into the fall, and those will then go through another set of public vetting and rounds of engagement to make sure that everybody is comfortable with the initial recommendations before they become finalized and adopted. Again, this is the goal of the conversation is not to get too granular about specific projects today, although the areas of concern will be noted and they are very, very vital to us. But we are trying to think at a citywide level for the most part in terms of some of the decision making that's happening in your general preferences and goals and objectives. And right now, I just want to give you a quick just side by side of the two alternatives so you can get a better understanding of some of the differences between them, differentiators. And so we have the financially constrained and the aspirational scenarios. And then within the financially constrained, we're talking about some of the things that are in existence right now, just building on those slightly, or some of the pilot projects that are out there, like the tactical mobility lanes with some of the downtown circulators and things like that, the shared bike and bus lanes that are happening on Washington Culver Boulevard. Some of these additional transit speed and reliability improvements outside in other parts of the city, whether it's signal priority, which allows the buses to move, gives the buses more green time essentially when they get near to an intersection. The things that are programmed within the city's capital investment program right now. What is the city looking at in the next 10 years? And what have they already funded? What have they already designed that they're looking to implement? And then some of these priority elements from the Bike and Pedestrian Action Plan. There are certain, obviously, financial constraints that are governing what gets incorporated into these assumptions underlying right now. It is not exhaustive. It does not include everything that's on the Bike and Pedestrian Action Plan because we are putting some constraints on it. And then where are some of these priority areas in terms of the connectivity and the nexus points for mobility hubs and some of those additional transportation related and mobility related services. How do we make sure that we're combining them in an efficient way, making space for them, and then providing them those connectivity elements that they need. And within the aspirational scenario, we're essentially just expanding on that, building on that, adding a little bit more muscle behind the projects and locations. So we may be expanding to more locations, we may be extending the treatments a little bit further, or just adding more service in general. And so that's generally how we're thinking about it. Obviously, the things in the aspirational alternative or scenario are not all funded, but it does include everything that's in the financially constrained. But those things above and beyond the financially constrained would require additional coordination with regional stakeholders potentially, or to secure additional funds for implementation. And right here is sort of our initial first draft map at what we were calling the fiscally constrained scenario. There is a lot going on here. We fully acknowledge that. It is probably going to take people a little while to digest everything that's on here. So we've put a couple of just quick bullet points on the left-hand side to give you a better indication of just what are we talking about doing within the financially constrained alternative. So number one, we're talking about making the tactical mobility lanes permanent, not just a 2-year experiment and pilot. We want to make sure those are there for the long term and the duration. We want to make sure we're introducing the local circulators within those areas where we are allowing that preserved space for alternative modes, being bus or bikes. We're improving the transit network to improve frequency to 30 minutes all day, 30 minutes or better all day, I should say, on all the fixed routes. Again, to try to help provide that reliability for people to feel confident. We're looking at some of these on-demand, what we call micro transit zones, and by on-demand micro transit, that's essentially kind of like a ride hailing service, but it's essentially smaller than a bus. It's maybe 8 to 12 passengers, 15 passenger vehicles. They operate within these yellow areas that you see on the map, primarily around the existing downtown E-Line station, and then over to the Hayden Tract in the Arts District area, and then the second one in the southern area of Culver City near the existing transit center, Fox Hills area, and extending out towards Playa Vista. And so those, again, are specific service areas where they have sort of basically not a designated fixed route like most buses operate, but essentially as long as you're in that area, you could get picked up and dropped off at anywhere within that area. So that's sort of how on-demand and shared mobility work in that sense, just so as you see that going forward. We're also talking about implementing over 12 miles of bike lanes, or a little under 12 miles of bike lanes, I apologize, and some additional pedestrian crossing improvements, whether you're talking about adding more signal time or adding mid-block crossings for long boulevards where you don't have a lot of opportunities to cross, and giving people some protection in terms of being able to navigate the pedestrian element. So just what you see here, just visually, I know the legend is probably super hard for you to read, and we're going to talk about this in much more detail in the breakout sessions. The purple dots are essentially mobility hubs. The orange dots are some site-specific, or squares are site-specific pedestrian improvements. The dashed lines are the bicycle network improvements. And then the solid red and yellow lines are the fixed route Culver City bus network. Some of these routes would not change in this image. The red routes are not necessarily changing other than increasing the frequency. The yellow route, which is the 6R, would change and be realigned slightly, as well as improving the frequency. As we move into the aspirational alternative, the things that you see on the left-hand side are grayed out because those are essentially those additive pieces that are already in the fiscally constrained. But what we're adding in terms of the new or additional infrastructure that you see here is some additional mobility hub locations. So I think we're going from 12 to 6. We're going from about 12 miles of bike lanes to about 21 miles of bike lanes. We're adding new fixed routes and realigning several other fixed routes within the network to provide a little bit more coverage and direct connections to destinations. We're talking about some new pedestrian crossings and bicycle and pedestrian crossings of Ballona Creek specifically, and potentially looking at additional on-demand service zones, again, to address some of the potential gaps in the network. So we'll talk a little bit more about gaps and other aspects and reactions in a moment. And so yes, you do see it's a little bit more transparent if you were able to sort of compare them side by side in terms of what the differences are between the financially constrained and the aspirational scenario. We're going to look at this a little bit more in detail again in the breakout rooms. But essentially what you're seeing here, this is where we try to simplify the map so that we're only showing the transit and mobility hubs here. We have another set of side by side with the bicycle and pedestrian network improvements. But what you see is that the existing fixed route network on the left is being modified in several places. Any of the yellow lines that you see on the right-hand side are modifications to some of the red lines on the left. There is one new red line here, which is a completely new route on the right-hand side. There are other new routes that are a little bit outside of the viewing area of this map. But this one on the south end here is connecting to the future Crenshaw North Metro rail station and going all the way across Lawson down onto Playa Vista to provide some connectivity to the existing transit center. There are other new fixed routes that are connecting to Century City and UCLA and a few other places as we realign the network to support. So just trying to give you a visual sense just for comparisons at this point in terms of how the fixed route network might change in the future. The existing routes are not going away. They may be a little bit harder to see, but they are in gray here. So the darker gray lines that you might see are the existing routes that aren't really being modified. So we added color only to those routes that are changing, but we are not removing any routes, just in case your eyes might not pick up on those immediately. As we look at the differences between the active transportation network, again, the financially constrained on the left, the aspirational on the right. We just looking at the coverage, you can see the expanded pedestrian and bicycle improvements within the aspirational scenario. As you get a little bit more into, I think that's the Clarksdale area, and a little bit more on the west side of Culver City, you see a lot more the bicycle network improvements there, and a little bit more in the south and around the crescent as well.